When no one watched them, when no orders arrived, and when hours passed without interruption or direction, what happens to a man when time itself becomes the only authority? And why did that quiet absence begin to change them more deeply than any guard ever could? At first, the change was almost impossible to notice, not because it was hidden, but because nothing visible announced its arrival, and the absence of supervision entered their lives the same way silence does, without sound, without interruption, and without demanding attention. There were no guards pacing behind them, no eyes following their movements from a distance, and no voices reminding them of limits. And this lack of presence did not feel like freedom in the way they had imagined it might, but like an unresolved condition that required interpretation. Time continued to move forward, marked only by light shifting across the ground and by the slow repetition of daily necessities. And in the absence of oversight, these markers became the only structure left to guide the day. At first, many assumed that supervision would return, that the quiet was temporary, and that the familiar rhythm of observation would reassert itself, restoring the invisible boundaries that had once defined acceptable behavior. Yet as hours passed without interruption, that expectation began to soften. Without being watched, actions lost their reference point, because behavior is often shaped not by rules themselves, but by the awareness of being seen. And when that awareness disappears, the mind is left to recalibrate its own limits. Some continued to act as they always had, maintaining routines out of habit alone, moving through tasks with a diligence that no longer had an audience, while others slowed gradually, not out of defiance, but because effort felt strangely untethered without acknowledgement. The absence of supervision did not invite chaos or rebellion, because rebellion requires something to push against, and here there was nothing, only open time and the quiet suggestion that nothing was expected. Hours stretched in unfamiliar ways, no longer compressed by urgency or oversight, and as they stretched, they began to weigh on the mind because unstructured time demands internal organization, and that organization had long been provided from the outside. In this environment, waiting did not feel like delay, but like the default state, and movement required a justification that no one was prepared to supply, leaving many suspended between intention and inaction. The men became acutely aware of time itself, not as a sequence of events, but as a presence, steady and unresponsive, moving forward regardless of what they chose to do within it. Without supervision to impose consequence, consequence itself became abstract, detached from immediate experience. And when outcomes are no longer visible, motivation begins to erode quietly. Days passed in which nothing happened, and it was precisely this lack of incident that began to shape behavior, because the mind adapts quickly to conditions that remain consistent, even when those conditions offer no clarity. Some noticed subtle changes in themselves, moments when decisions that once came easily now required thought, and moments when thought itself felt unnecessary, replaced by a passive acceptance of whatever the hour presented. Others felt the change more vaguely, as a dulling of urgency, a sense that nothing demanded immediate response, allowing time to pass without resistance or engagement. The lack of supervision removed the familiar contrast between action and consequence, leaving both suspended in a neutral space where effort and stillness appeared equally valid. In such a space, initiative became fragile because it depended entirely on internal momentum, and internal momentum, when unsupported, tends to dissipate. The camp remained quiet, unchanged, and indifferent, offering no signal that this absence of oversight was meaningful. Yet its neutrality allowed the condition to settle deeply, unchallenged and unexplained. As days accumulated, the men began to realize, often without articulating it, That time without observation behaves differently, not rushing, not pressuring, but slowly reshaping perception until stillness feels natural and movement feels optional. What unsettled them was not the freedom itself, but the responsibility that accompanied it, because when no one is watching, every action becomes self-authored, and self-authorship demands an energy that many no longer felt they possessed. In this way, the absence of supervision did not expand their world, but narrowed it, drawing attention inward and reducing the range of behavior that felt necessary or worthwhile. Time continued, steady and unconcerned, and within that steady passage, the first signs of change took hold, not through force or fear, but through the quiet realization that when nothing is observed, nothing feels required. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the absence of supervision continued without interruption, time itself began to behave differently, not because it changed its pace, but because the way it was perceived slowly shifted, stretching moments that once passed unnoticed and compressing others until the distinction between hours blurred into a continuous present. Without anyone watching, there was no external signal to mark progress or failure, and without such signals, effort lost its reference, becoming difficult to measure and easier to abandon, because unmeasured action rarely feels complete. The men began to sense that time no longer moved toward anything in particular, as though it had detached itself from outcome and now existed solely as duration, steady and indifferent to what filled it. In this condition, days no longer invited planning, because planning assumes consequence, and consequence requires observation, leaving the mind with little incentive to organize behavior beyond what was immediately necessary. Some attempted to impose structure on their own, dividing hours artificially, repeating small rituals, or returning to familiar habits. Yet these efforts often faded quickly, not through failure, but through exhaustion, as maintaining structure without reinforcement demanded constant attention. Others allowed time to unfold without interference, discovering that when nothing interrupts the flow, awareness gradually softens, and the edges of intention begin to blur, replaced by a passive acceptance of whatever the next moment contained. The absence of supervision removed the subtle pressure that once accompanied even the simplest actions, and without that pressure, movement felt optional in a way that quietly undermined its urgency. Moments of activity no longer stood out against moments of rest, because both occurred without comment, and when contrast disappears, meaning often follows. The men became increasingly attuned to the sensation of waiting, not waiting for a specific event, but waiting as a state in itself, a posture toward time that required neither effort nor resistance. In this posture, thought slowed, drifting rather than advancing, because without milestones or acknowledgement, there was little reason to push thought forward or hold it in place. The camp environment did nothing to disrupt this shift, offering no interruption, no evaluation, and no indication that this unobserved time carried significance, allowing the condition to deepen without challenge. As hours accumulated into days, and days into longer stretches, the men noticed that decisions now felt heavier, not because the stakes had increased, but because making a decision meant breaking the continuity of waiting, and breaking continuity required energy. The mind, seeking efficiency, began to favor the path of least disturbance, choosing stillness not as a deliberate act, but as a default, because stillness preserved equilibrium in an environment where nothing demanded imbalance. What made this state so enduring was its apparent neutrality, because nothing in it felt overtly negative, and without discomfort to prompt change, the motivation to alter behavior weakened steadily. Time without witnesses offered no feedback, and without feedback, behavior drifted, guided less by intention and more by inertia, until inertia itself felt stable. Some men sensed that something essential was changing, yet struggled to articulate it, because change usually announces itself through events. And here there were none, only the slow passage of unobserved hours. Others felt nothing at all, experiencing the days as a seamless continuation, each one resembling the last closely enough to require no adjustment, reinforcing the impression that this way of living was sufficient. In this environment, awareness narrowed, focusing on immediate sensation rather than future possibility, because the future offered no cues and the past provided no urgency. The longer time remained unobserved, the more it shaped behavior, not through command or threat, but through its steady refusal to acknowledge effort, teaching the men, quietly and persistently, that nothing required immediate response. By the end of this phase, time had ceased to function as a measure of progress and had become instead a container, holding days without distinguishing them. And within that container, stillness settled comfortably, unchallenged and increasingly complete. As the unobserved days continued to accumulate, the men began to experience a shift that was no longer limited to routine or behavior, but reached inward toward the way they understood themselves, because time, when left unchecked and unanswered, does not remain external for long. Without supervision to reflect their actions back to them, the sense of being an individual defined by choices and outcomes began to soften, replaced by a quieter awareness that simply existed alongside the passing hours. The absence of response created a strange neutrality, in which effort and inaction felt equally inconsequential, and when actions carry no visible echo, the mind gradually reduces its investment in defining itself through them. They did not feel erased or diminished in any dramatic way, but subtly diluted, as though the edges of identity were being worn smooth by repetition, leaving behind a simpler, less demanding presence. Time no longer asked who they were or what they intended to do, and in that silence, the need to answer those questions weakened, allowing the days to pass without self-examination. The men became less inclined to describe themselves in terms of purpose or direction, because purpose depends on movement towards something, and movement had lost its necessity in an environment that remained unchanged regardless of effort. Moments that once might have prompted reflection now dissolved quickly into the steady flow of hours, leaving little residue behind. And without residue, memory itself began to feel lighter, less anchored to meaning. They were aware of who they had been, but that awareness carried less immediacy, as though it belonged to a distant reference point rather than a living comparison, allowing the present to occupy more space without challenge. In the absence of observation, self-evaluation lost its urgency, because evaluation assumes an audience, even if that audience is imagined, and without it, there was little reason to measure oneself against expectation. The mind adapted by simplifying its demands, focusing on continuity rather than distinction, and valuing steadiness over expression, because steadiness required less internal effort to maintain. This simplification did not arrive as resignation, but as efficiency, a way of conserving energy in a setting where nothing required demonstration or assertion. As identity softened, so did the impulse to differentiate one day from the next, because differentiation requires intention, and intention had grown faint without external reinforcement. The men did not lose awareness of time, but they stopped using it as a framework for self-definition, allowing hours to pass without marking progress or decline. In this state, being present mattered more than being purposeful, and presence, stripped of expectation, became easier to sustain than direction. The camp remained silent and unchanged, offering no reflection of these internal adjustments, and its indifference allowed the transformation to proceed without interruption or commentary. Gradually, the men came to inhabit a version of themselves that required less explanation, less decision, and less engagement, shaped quietly by time that moved forward without witness. What replaced the earlier sense of self was not emptiness, but a narrowed awareness, sufficient for continuation, but disconnected from aspiration, because aspiration thrives on feedback, and feedback had long since vanished. By the end of this stage, identity had not disappeared, but it had settled into a quieter form, defined less by what was done and more by what was endured, molded by days that passed without observation and hours that asked nothing in return. As the days continued to pass without supervision or interruption, the changes that had been forming quietly within the men began to lose their visibility, not because they had reversed, but because they had settled into a steady state that no longer drew attention to itself. What once felt unfamiliar now felt ordinary, and what once invited reflection now passed without comment. Because the mind adjusts quickly to conditions that persist, especially when those conditions do not provoke discomfort or demand response. The absence of external reference points made it increasingly difficult to remember how things had felt before, not in terms of events or details, but in terms of internal contrast, because contrast requires comparison, and comparison had gradually faded from daily awareness. They no longer thought in terms of change occurring, because change implies movement from one state to another. And here there was only continuity, a smooth extension of yesterday into today that required no recalibration. Time continued its steady progression, but it no longer felt like something passing through them, and instead felt like something they were simply inside, a surrounding presence rather than a sequence to be marked or measured. In this environment, self-observation diminished further because observing oneself assumes a difference between who one is and who one might be, and that difference had grown indistinct, replaced by a quieter acceptance of the present condition. The men did not feel trapped, nor did they feel free, existing instead in a neutral space where evaluation seemed unnecessary and effort seemed optional, not as a conscious choice, but as an internal equilibrium that had formed gradually. What made this equilibrium so stable was its lack of tension, because tension invites resolution, and without tension, there was no pressure to reconsider or re-engage with questions that no longer felt relevant. They continued to perform basic actions when required, to speak when necessary, and to move when prompted by circumstance. Yet these actions no longer contributed to a sense of direction or progression, serving instead to maintain continuity. The mind, having adjusted to the absence of supervision, no longer anticipated its return, and without anticipation, there was no preparation, allowing the present to remain sufficient without reference to future change. Even moments that might once have felt significant now blended seamlessly into the flow of hours, leaving no lasting impression and requiring no interpretation, reinforcing the sense that nothing essential was occurring. In this way, the earlier changes ceased to register as changes at all, becoming simply the way things were. And once something becomes the way things are, it rarely invites scrutiny. The men adapted to this state not through agreement or decision, but through prolonged exposure, allowing stillness and neutrality to define the boundaries of daily experience. The absence of supervision continued to exert its influence not by shaping behavior directly, but by removing the conditions under which behavior might have been examined or altered. As days accumulated into longer stretches, the distinction between adjustment and identity blurred further, because what one adapts to long enough often becomes inseparable from who one believes oneself to be. By the end of this phase, the changes that had once emerged quietly had settled completely, no longer perceived as changes at all, but as a stable internal landscape shaped by time that moved forward without witness and without demand. As time continued to move forward without supervision or interruption, a quiet awareness began to surface among the men, not suddenly and not with clarity, but gradually, in brief moments that appeared and faded without demanding attention or response. This awareness did not announce itself as realization or regret, because it carried no sharp edge, emerging instead as a soft recognition that something within them had shifted long before they had noticed it, and that this shift had settled into place without resistance. They became conscious in an abstract and almost distant way that the absence of oversight had done more than alter routine, because it had reshaped how they related to time itself, turning days into containers rather than pathways. What made this recognition difficult to engage with was its lack of urgency, because urgency depends on contrast, and contrast had long since been dissolved by repetition, leaving awareness free to exist without consequence. Some sensed this change during quiet intervals, noticing that thoughts of before and after no longer carried emotional weight, appearing instead as neutral references disconnected from the present moment. Others experienced it as a subtle narrowing of expectation, an acceptance of continuity that no longer felt provisional, even though nothing had formally declared it permanent. The idea that something might have been lost did not fully form, because loss implies absence, and nothing tangible was missing, only a quality of engagement that had quietly faded without leaving a clear trace. Awareness functioned less as a call to act and more as an observation, acknowledged internally and then allowed to pass, because acting upon it would require disrupting a state that had come to feel internally coherent. The men did not interpret this awareness as failure or surrender, because those concepts depend on struggle, and struggle had gradually disappeared, replaced by a steady equilibrium that demanded little explanation. Time continued to pass without distinction, and with each uneventful day, the awareness softened further, not because it was resolved, but because it no longer asked to be examined. The environment offered no reflection of this internal shift, remaining unchanged and indifferent, and its neutrality allowed awareness to coexist with routine without influencing behavior. In this way, recognition arrived too late to alter the pattern, not because change was impossible, but because the pattern had already stabilized, supported by the accumulated weight of unobserved days. The men remained aware that supervision had once existed and that it could, in theory, return, yet this possibility felt remote, not as a fear or hope, but as a distant abstraction. What remained was not resignation, but continuation, a quiet persistence shaped by time that had moved forward without witness, gradually teaching the mind to exist without expectation. By the end of this stage, awareness no longer carried the potential to disrupt, having become simply another aspect of the internal landscape, present but unobtrusive. And so life continued, guided not by rules or oversight, but by the calm momentum of days that asked nothing and offered nothing, leaving the men shaped by time itself, long after the absence of supervision had ceased to be noticed at all. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the conclusion, because there was no single moment that could be pointed to as the cause or the result, only a long passage of time that had moved forward without witness and without resistance. What remained was not loss in a clear sense, nor acceptance in a conscious one, but a quiet continuity shaped by days that required nothing and asked no questions. Supervision had not been replaced, orders had not returned, and yet life continued smoothly enough that the absence itself no longer stood out. Time, left alone to do its work, had changed them not through force or command, but through patience, leaving behind a stillness that felt natural simply because it had lasted long enough. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.